Right, what I'm going to do is just rattle through some aspects to do with the Royal Arsenal. The first, which works, here we go. What I want to do is to just cover 6 areas of information to do with the Royal Arsenal. Starting with a brief history, because I always have to assume, of course, that there'll be one or two of you not quite so familiar with the detail of the Royal Arsenal than a lot of the members here. Then to talk about the regeneration that's happened and is ongoing at the Royal Arsenal work. Talk a bit about the Crossrail archaeology that was done within the site. A noisy spot here, I think we've got here. Then a little bit about how we used the Royal Arsenal Woolwich as part of the European programme work we did a few years ago, before moving on to talk about the more recent work at the Teardrop and the Riverside development to the west of the main site, and then something about the publication of all this archaeological work that's been happening. Right, so a brief history. This is the EastEnders shot. There we go. Royal Docks at Deptford, Woolwich Docks, and of course the Royal Arsenal site here, and all the other infrastructure works that built up around that activity. Its maximum extent included what is now Thamesmead area, which was sold off in the 60s. As the weaponry got larger and the range got further, so they needed bigger ranges to test these guns, and that's why the site expanded the way it did. As you know, the site started with a threat, a perceived threat to London, and Prince Rupert's Fort was one of the sites that was built as a battery of cannon to protect the Thames and London. That use quickly went out and became a focal point for storing supplies and other equipment nearby, and the creation of the laboratories in that area of the site, and so the start of the Royal Arsenal, as it later began from that humble beginnings. Obviously we have Tower Place, which became part of the complex of the site in the late 17th century. Quite a grand building, probably a later manifestation of an earlier manor house that was probably in this area. The laboratory buildings here and here, which survived. There's Hall Place Tower, working in the background, so the river's in that position over here. The arrangement of buildings was developed as a model for the site, with quite nice water features in the middle as well. And the regeneration of this area actually will have a fountain put back in the middle of the site. You can see them busy working away, stockpiling the cannonballs required. These are the 2 laboratory buildings that survived, for many years languishing on this large building site, and that's one of the buildings now restored and with a new roof put on. The Royal Laboratories started obviously as a fairly low-key affair in many ways. It was very much a cottage industry type of industrial work that was going on, very much handcrafted work, not much in the way of machinery in evidence here. The Royal Brass Foundry developed on the site. That work expanded into the area of the Great Palm behind Darl Arch. And you start to see some of the machinery starting to appear, turning lathes, but still quite small affairs, but sufficient to work the armaments that were being produced at that time. Obviously training was important developments for the site's functions. We have the Royal Military Academy building in view. And so by 1818, here's the laboratory squares here. The Prince Rupert's Fort has completely disappeared off the map, because obviously as the land here, this line here, everything to the south was dry land, and all this is reclaimed marshy land to the north. So the Prince Rupert's Fort has been lost underneath this building up and building out of the land into the River Thames. By this stage you've got the grand stores having been built, and also the Pilkington Canal has been built to bring supplies into the site. And it also acts as a nice buffer between where people are working and where the test ranges are beyond. This is one of the interiors to the grand stores. If you had a chance to look around the grand stores before they were converted, but large cavernous structures, very reminiscent of a barn type of construction. It would have been decked out with racking for all sorts of supplies that would be required to be loaded onto the ships. And of course these squares, these which were developed as courtyards for different functions, rapidly developed. All available space was then utilised, so you have extra workshops being constructed within the spaces of these courtyard arrangements of buildings. And so you end up with a sea of workshop roofs across the whole site. Every ounce of space was being utilised. When the military left, this is roughly the buildings that survived. Some of these buildings have obviously also since gone. But military, rather than give names to these buildings, gave them numbers. So often you'll see in plan applications reference to building 10 or building 13 and 14 and so on, and 15 and 16 for the 2 laboratory buildings and so on. So that's where the numbers come from. Through the archaeological work that Oxford undertook, we did eventually see a little bit of this corner of the Prince Rupert's Fault, which meant for the first time we could accurately lock it in on modern mapping, because until then all the features you saw on the old mapping are no longer visible. Even the boundary of the rivers obviously changed in that time as well. So that meant we could actually lock it into position in relation to the later buildings, and actually plot in also the stream that fed water into the moat, the area here, that runs through this area and this part of building 10. This plan also shows the different phases of development of the arsenal, starting from this area and then expanding out for the grand stores, and then this way for the workshops into the eastern part of the site. Obviously the guns are getting larger, and more space is required to store them, as well as larger buildings to manufacture these items. Mechanical innovations start to occur quite early on the site and develops right the way through. This is a sawmill, which obviously saved a lot of time and probably more accurate as well. The chemical laboratories expanded. They were researching a lot more with chemicals and different types of compositions of materials. Even basic things like quicklime mortar being worked on here. So we're looking about 50 years after the Battle of Trafalgar, and ship technology hasn't changed that much. It's just got bigger. But Nelson would recognise these sort of ships. But within a few years of that, the Industrial Revolution had really taken over, and these are the sort of ships that are being produced only sort of less than 30 years later. Basically large iron ships which are platforms for enormous guns. And obviously all the small arms had to be produced. You can imagine how noisy and dangerous these sort of environments were for people. This is 1900, so you see all the men working away here. And then of course during the First World War, heavy usage of women labour as the men had gone to war, working away here in munitions. During the archaeological work on the main site, it was important to look at the architect drawings and plans, because often you'll find on the ground they didn't match up to the drawings. Obviously, as you know, there's a large archive at Kew, so that was utilised during the course of the fieldwork stages of clearance. So, comparing the drawings with the reality, you can start to understand why potentially changes were made during the construction. Then you've got things like the large gun mounting sheds. What use can these spaces be converted to if we're going to see them saved. So by the 1860s the site has expanded. Here's the canal again. All this area is now being developed out, and the rangers are starting to push out into the marshes. The Arsenal was divided up into different functions. So you had the blast foundry works over here, shown in red. You've got the stores department in blue. You've got the carriage department here, so anything you wanted moving, they would make the carriage for it to be mounted onto. And obviously the ironworks, which expanded over time further eastwards as well. But of course, they all operated in their own way, these different departments, and at times the superintendents didn't even talk to each other. So they might change the specification for the gun, but they didn't tell the carriage department, so they carried on making the carriages for, that couldn't be used. So in the end, the government imposed a central admin office, strategically placed right in the middle of the site, in order that the site was run more efficiently and more cost effectively. And this is probably a very important move prior to the First World War, because if these departments had carried on acting in their own way, things could have been a little bit different. Of course, during the First World War, up to 80,000 people worked at the Arsenal doing 12-hour shifts. So you can imagine the throng of people coming and going through this gate and other gates to the Arsenal. And of course, I'm sure you're familiar with the hit from the First World War. The Woolwich singers do sing this, so next time they're singing, you have to go along and request that they sing it for you. I'm not going to try and sing it to you. But yes, it was a national hit at the time. Okay, so the regeneration work. Obviously we started off with something like 22 listed buildings on the site, from grade 1 to 2-star and 2. But you can also see there are a number of other buildings which weren't listed at the time, the admin building and some of the later stores buildings. So in 1964 the MOD closes the Royal Arsenal site, and for the next 20 years they clean up the site. There's a lot of contamination on the site, particularly with the stuff they chucked in the old canal. And they also cleared some of the other buildings. Some of the buildings would have been nice if they'd actually left them, so we could enjoy them today. But that's happened over that period. And then in 1997 the site was eventually sold by the MOD to English Partnerships and their local offshoot, the London Development Agency, for £1. But the MOD did have to pay something towards the cost of cleaning up and making the site usable for other purposes. So 23.9 million was contributed to a budget of 48.2. The LDA calculated that they actually needed something more like 120 million if they were going to do the job properly. So they had to try and juggle what they could actually achieve on the site that was sufficient to attract developers into the site to take that risk and take on the regeneration of this large historic site. There were other funds available, single regeneration budget, housing lottery funding, some EU funds as well, and housing association enabled the LDA to undertake a bit more work than would otherwise be the case. Their expenses, there was a management cost, there was certain demolition work to be done, there was contamination that had to be removed, like asbestos, which you can imagine was quite wide on the site. They had to put in all the infrastructure, all the drainage, all the cabling, all the lighting, the roads, and so on. And obviously all the planning work to put together the master planning, and all the fees that go with that, all that had to be paid for. So the LDA let the contract for the infrastructure in 1999. That was the first thing that had to happen. A year later, Berkeley Homes won the award for the residential part of the development, and the consortium, the IO group, developed the light industrial works on the eastern part of the site in 2001. So the first stage was the master plan, basically setting out the basic principles of what sort of functions are going to have, where the housing is going to be, where the heritage quarter is going to be, where the industrial part is going to be, where your main access roads are going to be through the site, where the entrance points into the site are going to be, and how many units are going to be built within that space. General parameters. And we're now working on our 5th master plan for the Arsenal since it started. So obviously, as the site, as the area of the covered by the master plan changes, and other things come along like Crossrail, the master plan has to change in order to reflect these changes. So that's the process we've been working through since the start of this, reacting to each master plan proposal as it comes along. So one of the original schemes had this sort of design. You have a nice little park here, you have a big development here. We've lost the admin building, but we have got all the stores buildings up here. But the layout is quite different and is quite open in many respects. A large open area here, public realm. So yeah, quite different to what we see today, but so that was the original concept. And obviously I've mentioned that obviously the area of the master plan is covering has changed, and obviously here's the Arsenal site over here, and it's taken on what is now the riverfront area as well as the Teardrop. So the Arsenal master plan has expanded westwards to take in these areas. So in terms of the archaeological work, Oxford Archaeology have been doing some work every year since 1999 on the site. So it's like a reunion when they come back on the site, because and sometimes they've been there pretty much all year for a couple of years at a time. So it's been a lot of work for them, and some of the light industrial work areas were done by pre-construct archaeology over a 3-year period. So the archaeological sequence, the approach for each area of the Arsenal site was to pull together all existing information that was available that's relevant to that site in terms of desk space assessment. For the building recordings phases, it was to understand what that building meant in terms of the whole site, as well as what the building can tell us about its own phasing. You undertake most of the recording work at the initial stage before it's touched. You supplement that when full ceilings and partition walls come down, and you can see much more of the original structure. So you do more recording then. And then when they're actually knocking through or doing the underpinning, that's when you can do the 3rd and final stage of recording on a building. So it can be spread out over a long period of time, actually, from the initial recording to when you actually finish looking at the foundations and so on. And some of the work is quite obviously detailed, particularly if you're looking at roof designs, because they were experimenting with roof designs, prefabricated roof designs, quite a lot on the Arsenal site. So quite early examples of roof design you'll see here, that you then see replicated in various places around the British Empire later on. In terms of the archaeological fieldwork side, again you start off by understanding what is already known about that part of the site. You then look at where the main structures are likely to be on the site. You may want to then test that by undertaking trial trenching to see what does survive and where, and what the quality of that survival is, how extensive it might be. Then you might go on to limited area excavation, looking at the archaeology of that particular location, and then as the remediation or site clearance works happens, you then use a range of machinery sizes to take out the soft material to expose the structures so they can be cleaned up and recorded before remediation takes the level down again. And during that stage you then follow up all the work you've done with observation recording in tandem with that, so you can again add another layer of information on the record you've been accumulating. And here you see one of the steam hammer bases being excavated. So some of the artefacts are quite large on site. You wouldn't put that in a museum. And certainly some of the early work that was done was quite large area stripping, and you can see the original, the surviving floor levels and building plans visible here. In fact, I think over this side you start to see some of the Roman graves that were in the Darn Arch area. And here's an overview looking south. There's Darn Arch looking from the back, which has now got another range built on at the back of it. It's very, and if you look at the brickwork, have a close look at the brickwork. They've married up the old brickwork with the new extremely well, and even to the point, the style of pointing, and the detailing in the brick. It's very, it's worth a close examination if you're interested in bricks. Anyway, here's the brass foundry works. Obviously started over here and expanded into this space. The dark areas are the casting pits. Here's one of the kilns, furnaces, with a big chimney over this space. It would be extremely hot in that area to work. Here's one of the casting pits which was looked at. Quite big affairs, but you need that size if you're going to be casting cannon. They're finding small items as well. Lots of shot and casing, and obviously to do with the Roman cemetery, a range of pottery coming up as well. So if we lay that all together, we've got the different periods of building work at the site. We've got the Prince Rupert's Fault, we've got the stream coming through Building 10. When we were doing the work on Building 10, we did look hard for any sign of the stream, and there was no evidence whatsoever, unfortunately. The structures that were built on the reclaimed land, of course, had to have significant foundations to stop them falling over. And in fact, on occasions they did partially collapse because they were on extremely soft ground and the foundations weren't good enough. The structure would be that you put a whole series of timber piles in the ground, you then lay timber rafting on top, and then your big stone blocks on top of that, and then you construct your building. So that's how the ground stores, for example, that's the foundations they will sit on. And if you walk around the south side of the ground store, and you walk to the eastern end of the ground store from the south side, you'll see where the building is actually settled significantly. You see the bricks and the window casings change in position, but the ground is actually settled by about a foot. And there's a view showing the timber pile. There's one of the timber piles. This is part of the rafting underneath the stonework and then brick-based brickwork. You can see how the pressure, how the weight has actually distorted that beam. The pile has stayed exactly in the right position, but the beam was bent underneath all that weight. Here's one of the steam hammer bases. The ground level would have been at that point, so this would have been below ground, and the steam hammer would have sat on top. But because of the huge amount of pounding that these steam hammers were exerting to pound the hot metal into shape, it's actually cracked this single cast into 4 pieces. A single piece of iron has been shattered into 4, and the base plate, which is that thick, has equally been broken into several pieces. So this is what they would have looked like. What we've just seen is that component, and that's the substructure stopping it disappearing into the silt of Woolwich. Unfortunately, of course, we've lost all this machinery on top. But the pounding was so severe that when these steam hammers were working, you could feel the vibration through your feet. If you were walking around central London, you could feel it. But they had such control over these machines. There were records of them carrying out demonstrations of fine-tuning the equipment, so all it did was to crack the shell of an egg without breaking it. They had that sort of control over these. Here's one of several. These are now on display on site, looking quite splendid. As a reminder of the former use of the site, and reminds people coming into the site for the first time what the industrial heritage of the site actually is all about. Here's one of those which you see on display today, being lifted off its base. One of the dipping squares, again, we looked at the plans, the architect's plans, and it did change quite a lot, particularly how the internal structure was configured. And we assumed that this was because it was found that people could move around this space much better and do the job much better and much faster if they changed the layout of some of these areas. Also, you find bits and pieces sometimes which have been discarded because they're no longer required, and they're chucked into the ground as part of the foundations of buildings. So there was something like 70 odd bits of timber, which are actually from the Georgian period, bits of naval gun carriages, siege gun carriages, and land carriages, all from the Georgian period. The carriages you often see today are either modern or Victorian in date. You tend not to find Georgian gun carriages surviving, so this was quite rare. We found specialists down at Gosport Museum who were keen to take on the material, not only to conserve it, but to also write up the specialist papers that this collection required. Unfortunately, over time, the staff left, the museum went into bad times. So I managed to persuade Gosport Council to pay for the conservation of artefacts from Woolwich up at York. And only this year that they've come back, having been treated over those years. And now they're on their way to Portsmouth Museum, where they're keen to take the material and write up this material. So we never give up. This is when they were being found and being stored initially. We're trying to keep them wet in a temporary tank while they could be transported. And of course, you're always finding cannon in various places. This was recovered from the area of the former Pilkington Canal, and you can see the concrete up to this point. So it clearly had been used as part of a mooring point on the side of the canal, and this was a chain that was attached to it. We also find underneath buildings gun liners such as this, where you can see the rifling inside. The guns that these went into are the same as those you see outside the Imperial Museum today. The ships would come into Woolwich, the guns would be taken off, the gun would then be heated up so it expanded away from the gun liner. The gun would then be held up on end and the gun liner allowed to drop out, and they could then put in a new gun liner in and let the gun cool back onto the inner tube. Because the weaponry was corrosive, then lasted so long we needed replacing the liners. So it was a big operation. When we found 4 of these, they've gone to various homes in the Midlands and other museums. And of course, as part of the structures that you see around the site, we also have informative posters which are surviving quite well, dotted around the site, so you can see what that part of the Arsenal would have looked like at different times in history, and learn something about the function of the Arsenal in that area. So quite useful. Right, so once the site work's been done, you've then got, for each area, summary statements being produced, and those all being stored on the Historic Environment Record. They then build up into department-wide interim assessments that then feeds into the publication proposals for the whole of the Arsenal site. So it's a whole series of building stages right the way through. Quickly move on to Crossrail. More buildings to do with the Arsenal as you move back towards the Plumstead Road as it is now. This is various quarters, buildings and so on in this area. This is all carefully recorded before it's moved. It looks quite a jumble, but it's as we cleared an area, so they came in to work that when we then moved on to record the next bit and so on. So that worked quite well for that level. And obviously the station box, because obviously as you know Crossrail wasn't necessarily going to have a station at Woolwich to start with, but we've now got the station box here under construction. It will be done by using a machine to excavate a deep slot trench around the outside of the area, which is then reinforced and concrete poured. And once that's in, you can then excavate the space between. And then when you get to a certain depth, you then put in bracing, which is actually recycled Eastern European gas pipes that have been recycled, before you excavate down and down and down to the depth that you need to go. And you can see in this area it's quite silty, sandy deposit you're actually digging into here. And lo and behold, doesn't show particularly well, but you can see a darker band through here. That's the silt of our ditch, our stream. We finally found it. The stream that fed Prince Rupert's Fault, and we've lost it since then. We've now got it here. In fact, Berkeley Homes were keen to keep us a face of this material as, if you like public art in the finished station. So when you come down the escalator, you had this section of all the different coloured silts of the stream. But Crossrail didn't like that idea. So here's Oxford Archaeology working away. It had to be stepped, this section, because obviously being just loose sand, effectively, you don't want a long section that could collapse on people. So you stagger it, but you can record that strip, that, and then put all those sections together to give you a complete illustration of how this deposit is silted up. Here's a view from up at one of those terraces, and quite disconcerting because you're left on a ledge and they're carrying on excavating down and down around you. But within that, we did find several timbers driven into the silts. Carbon dating was quite wide, and you shouldn't really do this, but if you take the middle date, which you can't necessarily take as reliable, but the middle date would put these within the same period as Prince Rupert's Fault. So whether there was a small bridge across this stream that was put up, constructed at the same sort of time that Prince Rupert's Fault was being created, that would fit. And you can see how the timbers have been shaped to get the points of the post to be rammed into the ground. And of course you always find cannon when you're excavating the outside, there's some more there. Having constructed the concrete box, they put up these 4 artists' pictures on the wall to show where the tunnel was going to bore its way through. And there's a view looking back the other way, looking right underneath all this area to the far end. In fact, the box was big enough that it could take the #1 tower at Canary Wharf lying down. It's that big. And the technology is that when you create a big box like that, you would get ground heave. And so the ground is trying to push the box up out the ground. And therefore there had to be temporary small piles built into the floor as a temporary anchor until they could build those big tower blocks that are now sitting over the station box, which were designed to produce sufficient weight to counteract the upward motion that would be otherwise exerted on the box. So everything's in equilibrium that way. Okay, quickly mention the European project. This was done a few years ago now, but we took all the work we've been doing at the Royal Arsenal and celebrated all that, and we introduced the Arsenal back into the European context by partnering with other organisations. So SHARP is Sustainable Historic Arsenal Regeneration Partnership. Probably fit in every buzzword I could think of. So we partnered organisations in Estonia, Malta and Cadiz in Spain, looking at military sites redundant military sites that they had and the issues that they were trying to grapple with in their countries. For Woolwich, we were leading on that project, supported by the London Development Agency. Stakeholder support was provided by Berkshire Homes and the Borough Council, and additional support from Oxford Archaeology, 21st Century Era Limited, which is a management company that helped us with the funding side, and Llewellyn Davis Yang, who were involved with the master planning aspects, and Firepower Museum helped us a lot with hosting the end conference and other activities that we had. So the project was to go and to learn about these other projects and quickly identify what were the lessons that we could come away with. The London Development Agency, after each project, is supposed to reflect on how well or how less well it actually performed. But because it's always running from project to project, it doesn't normally have that chance. So it's an opportunity for the LDA, the London Development Agency, to reflect on how the work at the Arsenal actually did progress, and so we had some useful, candid contributions from them for that. And obviously disseminate the results of all this collaboration. But through sharing these different sites, quickly 6 themes came through as common to all sites, and certainly applicable to the Woolwich example. So any regeneration of a historic site should consider each of these 6 topics. The emphasis you apply to any one will be dependent on the circumstances of your own particular site. But if you're going to have anything that is sustainable, you need to consider these different aspects in some detail. I don't want you to need to read all that, but one of the output messages that we gave was that there was a need to develop a sustainable tourism strategy, and that requires partnership with other enterprises in the area, and also phasing the long-term regeneration programme of the site in the correct order is critical as it's key to sustainable regeneration. And I'm particularly worried that with the struggles that Firepower was experiencing at the time, and of course we all know what's happened to Firepower. For many years it was in the middle of effectively a building site, and there was never a third museum attraction on site to make it a sufficient draw to get people to travel out from London further than Greenwich to travel on to Woolwich. You can see that you can obtain copies of the publication we produced through which are available on the Historic England website. But if you don't want to write that all down, if you just Google my name and Sharp, you'll find it that way. Okay, Teardrop and Riverside, moving on to. As I showed you earlier, this is the Riverside area. Teardrop is down here. So first of all, Teardrop. I started work on this some years ago now. So Teardrop is this area here, so named because of the shape of the plot of land. This area is the rope yard. At the time, first built in the Elizabethan period, and became the longest rope yard in the country when it was running. We started off with trial trenching, but because of the working arrangements we had, where we turned some of these evaluation areas into small area excavations to try and deal with as much archaeology as possible while we had the opportunity to get into these spaces. The hashed blue area through here was a no-go area where there's a massive high voltage cable which supplies the whole of Thamesmead. And of course this is pretty much the route also where the Crossrail tunnel runs. So what we were finding were a lot of kilns from 1200 to 1500 in date in the silts in certain areas where the accumulation of silt had survived. Here's one particularly nice example of kiln coming through. In fact, you can't quite see it, but there's an earlier kiln underneath that this kiln's built on top of. This would be your main structure, and you would remove and replace the roof of this kiln between firings. So when the kiln goes out of use, it would then be filled with with one lot of wasters that were available that had just been produced on the site. So back at Oxford Archaeology, they have a lot of pottery, because I got them to take the whole collection from that, because you've got one discrete group rather than a massive scatter which you've got otherwise elsewhere across the site. So that will give us a window into the range of material they were producing at any one time. And you get really detailed pottery being produced, even things, roof decoration coming through. Some really nice examples. And of course on the Teardrop we had the extension of the massive ditch that Brian Filk first saw in the late 80s on what is now the Riverside part of the site to the north. Massive ditch, 8 metres deep by 12 metres wide at its top. Very little in the way of artefacts within the silt, very clean. So what ended up happening was we took some what's called OSL datum, which is if you've got buried soils which have not been exposed to daylight, you can test them and get a date when that silt was formed. And it showed that this ditch is late Iron Age in date. Massive dip. When we came to the Riverside area, we had another chance of picking up the ditch further north. And here you are, you can see the ditch here. And this is the photograph of Brian's excavation back in the 80s of this feature. Either the ditch wasn't as substantial here as it was further south, which is quite possible, because if the entranceway, which we've not yet seen, is on the southern side, then you would expect the ditch to become more impressive the nearer you get to the entranceway. So that ditch that's where Brian excavated. This is where we've excavated, and we've now seen it here as well. It's coming through in this sort of position. We also had another ditch coming through here in that sort of orientation, which is early Roman in date. So they were subdividing this larger Iron Age enclosure into subsections by the early Roman period. I'll put this in. This is a screenshot from the historic environment record that we use back in the office. This is the area of the Royal Arsenal here. Teardrop is through here, and Riverside is there. What this is showing coming through Newham, that is the line of a Roman road. And it's not deviating towards London, it's not deviating down to the coast, it's heading straight for the Thames. This area is under at least 12 metres of made ground. So if and when this area is developed in the future, we might get a chance to see what's happening here. But it could be in this area, we've got something similar to what we've seen in Woolwich over here. We've got a river crossing, and that's what this enclosure is dealing with, is your crossing point. Because all this is marsh right the way up to Erith. So Roman road's coming through here. The Roman cemetery we've seen will be on the edge of the road, even though we've not seen the road. It's fully underneath Plumstead Road, next to Crossrail station now. Heading towards this enclosure and the access to cross the river to head north. Makes all sorts of sense. So anyway, I'll put that in because often you think, look at this sort of area and try and make sense of that, and you see the river as a barrier. You need to look, sometimes you need to look across the river to make sense of what you've got south of the river. Okay, then let's move on to the Riverside part of the work. We've done a whole series of phases, 6 7 and 8 next door, marching from east to west as each phase of development comes through. We've got another phase to do yet, just to finish off that area. Here's the back of the Heritage Centre over here. Rivers on that side. And you can see, even though this area is, a lot of industrial activity was on this side, there's a lot of archaeology to be recorded and sorted out. We rediscovered some of the things that Brian found, such as lovely guardrail, beautifully made out of tile. Brian actually excavated the whole field, so we had nothing left within this space. And we've got various floors. There's a furnace relic here. It's been chopped by this later feature, but there's part of a fire here. And we also found on bits of building surviving. Obviously an earlier wall here that's been rebuilt here. A lot of reused stonework and so on in this. This is probably relating to the manor house that predated the Hall Place. So Hall Place would have been built in front of the older building, because you're not going to make yourself homeless while you're building a new home. So this is part of that sequence, taking us back further in time. This photograph was taken by one of the crane drivers, so apologies for the slightly blurry. Hopefully his nerves are better than his camera, been up that high. We can see because of the way the site's been worked, obviously the sheet piling has to go in first, and then their programme is analysed in detail and discussed in detail at numerous meetings, and then the phasing of the archaeological work in tandem with the activities they need to do to clear the site portion by portion, to make sure the archaeology joined up as part of that process. So it looks a difficult space, but it does actually work quite well if you plan it very in a detailed way before you start. So here's an area, this has all been handed back, this has all been dealt with, and we're just left with this area up here to deal with. Because the original ground level was up here, and it's already been reduced to that level, so that's all made ground above these remains here that's now been excavated back to the surface. So you can see that all this land has been built up and built out quite a bit. Right where we expected there to be a lot of Iron Age and Roman occupation evidence surviving, we had the gasworks. But very interesting gasworks too. 1837 to 87, I think. It was quite an early example of coal gas development, so I'm told. So there's a chance to obviously deal with industrial archaeology. This was the base of one of those tanks. But right bang in the middle of the site where we expected all the earlier archaeology would have been. But you can't have everything, I suppose. And you can see here, behind the plate that's been taken out, you can see the natural geology is very much layers of very fine sand that have been built up over a long period. Slightly blurry, I'm afraid. I took this from a publication. This is going parallel to the river. This is on the inside of the curve of the main ditch that is running on the Riverside development area north of the Teardrop, running east-west orientation. Oops. And this is actually early Iron Age ditch. So there's been reworking of this promontory, if we can call it that, over a long period of time. And in fact, this ditch produced a sherd of Bronze Age pottery, early Bronze Age pottery. So this high dryland spot next to open water of the Thames, rather than having to go through boggy marsh to get to water, has been used time and time again all through prehistory. It looks a bit, I'm assuming this feature. What you've got here is a post hole, and here's the post pipe, and this is the packing that would have been around the post hole, around the post. As the timber's rotted and the silt has replaced the timber, you end up with that profile. You can see that how the soil is accumulated where the rotted timber was, and it's all packing around it. Nothing else appeared to be in association with this particular feature. But underneath the post was a collection of late 1st century silver coins, and there were a couple of brooches. But all this material is not stone; it's lumps of Roman painted plaster. So where this has come from, why they were doing this, obviously jokingly called it a totem pole, but it could have been a post for a beacon or something. It could, it could be a signal post. Who knows? Hopefully during post-ex work we can work out some more of the detail. I showed you a photograph earlier showing an area of land to one side that hadn't been reduced to the same degree that the machinery was all working to. And over this side we had a layer of soil still surviving that hadn't been truncated by all the later industrial developments on the site. And you can see people busy working away here, and we had no suggestion that anything like this would survive on the site or occur on the site. We had a Saxon cemetery. In the end, 76 individuals were accounted for, men, women and children. I think one had a knife blade, but that was the only artefact found with these bales. They're all orientated east-west, and their date range is 7th to 9th century from the carbon dating so far, and obviously more work needs to be done yet. But this isn't poor archaeology here. This is where later works have tromped through to a lower level and removed the lower legs and the feet of this individual. Obviously this cemetery was in use for quite a period of time. This individual is at a higher level to that one, and in fact you can see that this individual is over the top of another individual. You can see the jawbone here. And another shot of another one. And again, you've got the skull, the rib cage here, and you can see underneath the head of another grave that would have run through this in this position. So they're quite shallow graves, but they've been carefully positioned, not to remove the earlier burials, but it's obviously been built up over quite a period of time. And one of the reasons why they survived, they're up in this area here. And that's because in the Georgian and obviously mainly Victorian period, you have this road running through, and because you didn't have buildings with basements over this area, the cemetery that happened to be underneath the road, this part of the cemetery survived. We also obviously had all the tenement buildings running through, the workshops and so on, surviving from the Victorian period and earlier. You can see this would have been a street on this side, so these would have been facing the street, and these are the dwellings and workshops running off behind. And we had various cesspits, and you can see cesspit being sectioned here, and every time it got to a certain state that had to put some soil on top to seal it before they started to carry on using it again. You end up with a whole series of layers accumulating. Not particularly well built, these properties, not really any foundations. And you can see where there was an earlier feature here, the wall was actually sunk into the fill, but obviously somehow it managed to keep standing. Obviously they built in these small buttresses in the brickwork to help support the wall, to stop it falling over, but very poor building quality in this area. Some of the one or two places we found what's been interpreted as clay pipe kilns in the floors of the buildings. So more small-scale industry going on within this area of what's called the dust hole. And what we wanted to do was obviously make sure we lifted the floors in case we had truncated earlier archaeology survived, and at least we could look at. And we also had a washstand that had been left propped up against the side of the building wall before it was demolished and backfilled in the late 19th century. So there's a nice marble washstand there for someone wants one. And also you find odd traces, sections of much earlier wall, and here you can see the tile in with the chalk blocks, much earlier, similar to the original buildings we saw on the earlier phase. So it's possibly part of the outbuildings for the manor. But it's been utilised as part of the later buildings that have gone up in this area. So it would have still been visible to some degree that they could then utilise for their new build. This is a 17th century ditch with lots of rubbish chucked in, including this nice pot here. And when it was cleaned up, completely intact, whether it's for washing, had a say a wooden sink and you had your pot with water in for washing, or it was a child's potty, who knows? Obviously a lot more research needs to be done, but very rare example of a pottery item of this type from that date. So a lot more research needs to be done. So over this area, here's the Teardrop down here, Royal Arsenal's over here. This is part of the Riverside area. Lots of industrial activity occurred in the late 19th and early 20th centuries over here. So you'd expect a lot of archaeology would have been trashed in that area. But if I overlay the map that we generated through the archaeological work in that phase of the site, that's the density of archaeology we were getting. That's your Saxon cemetery up here. When we came to dig this phase, we only found one more grave. So we've got 79 burials in total. It's just the way the later buildings have truncated the cemetery. The cemetery would have been much more extensive than its survival. But we've got a lot of industrial activity against the river in this area that has taken out the archaeology. We've also got some more of these buildings here. Here's the lane coming up through that space and some of the buildings on that orientation, as well as some earlier archaeology in that area. And if I put on that's where it would have sat. So you imagine that blank area taken out, you would actually see how big an area is actually being recorded now. And you see the complexity of archaeology that does survive underneath these industrial landscapes. The archaeology is still there to be seen. So publication, moving on to that finally. During the years, quite a few years ago, I tried to develop a model of how all the fieldwork and all the information would come together into a definitive publication. And obviously in that time we've had the Woolwich volume by the Survey of London, which has a very comprehensive chapter on the history of the Arsenal itself. So we don't need to cover that aspect, which is good. But initially, because of the original master plan, in the original master plan there was a thing called a Section 106, which is the developers' obligations to provide money for buses to run, or for school places, or whatever it is that the local council wants to see a developer contribute towards. There was no provision for post-excavation archaeology publication at all in that. But through various incremental stages, in the 5th master plan, section 106, we now have a fairly good section dealing with how that there has to be a strategy agreed with Historic England by the developers of how to bring all this information to publication and how you disseminate that. They then have to submit that to the Borough Council, and then within 1 year of that submission it has to be implemented. So we've gone a long way over these 16 years, but we're getting there. So initially we was thinking in terms of a volume dealing with the whole of the Royal Arsenal site, top down. But as the site's evolved, it's become clear we need to do something slightly different. We'll have one publication which deals with the historic Royal Arsenal archaeology and buildings. Oxford Archaeology have recorded all the buildings on the site. So there's a lot of building technology to be digested. So there'll be one to deal with all the Royal Arsenal archaeology, another volume to deal with the Teardrop and Riverside archaeology, which is very much your pre-Arsenal archaeology for this area. In terms of the Roman archaeology and other bits and pieces that are within the Arsenal site, such as the Roman cemetery, it makes sense for that evidence to migrate into the pre-Arsenal volume that we're looking at for this area. This is all covered by the one master plan area. And then on top of that, there's the expectation that there would also be a popular style booklet, which would be very heavy on illustrations, on graphics, reconstruction drawings, photographs of some of the key artefacts and so on, to walk you through the history of, and celebrate the history of Woolwich, so the archaeology and the work that's been done. So that's what we're aiming to do. So in terms of that 106, we're at the stage of discussing with the developers the structure of the strategy. Once we've got into a position where we're all happy with that, they will then take that through to the council and off we go. So after 16 years, we're starting to actually see some progress in getting this publication through. Because the trigger for this discussion has to be the completion and the occupation of so many residential units on site. And we've now reached that point, hence the trigger to implement this section of the agreement for this whole regeneration of the site. So that's what we're trying to do with the Royal Arsenal to present, but it does take a long time to get there. In terms of the Teardrop and Riverside area, we've now done enough archaeology, there's a bit more to do, but we've done more than enough to enable the post-excavation work to start. There's a lot of work to process. And by the time we get to the end of that process, these additional areas will be available to be woven into that story. So we should see some progress in the next year or two to see that come through. But again, it's going to take a while for that to manifest into an actual publication. So, but we will get there. It's a long process, but we will get there. So there we are. So that's about an hour or so. So I hope that's useful run through. We've done a lot of work since I last spoke on the Riverside and Teardrop area. So it's adding a whole new dimension to the archaeology that we've got for the Royal Arsenal. But an important part, given that we've now got 77 individuals of the original foundation of Woolwich. Thank you.